Imagine waking up in a world where exams had never been invented. No homework, no report cards, no teachers shouting, "Time's up." Sounds like the perfect life, doesn't it? More than 2,000 years ago, one emperor faced a serious problem. His kingdom was growing bigger every single year, but there was one huge problem. Who could he trust to run such a massive empire? Think about it for a second. Would you give an important job to someone without knowing if they were actually smart? Or would you test their knowledge first? That question changed history forever. But here's something even more surprising. The first exam wasn't created to help students. It was created to choose the smartest adults in the entire kingdom. So, where did the very first exam actually begin? Most people think it started in Europe. But that's completely wrong. The real answer takes us to ancient China more than 2,000 years ago. And what happened there changed education forever. But here's the part almost nobody knows. The first exams were never meant for children. They were designed to find the smartest people in the entire empire. But why would an emperor trust a piece of paper more than his own friends? The answer completely changed the future of civilization. The story begins in ancient China, around 2,200 years ago. At that time, China was one of the largest and most powerful empires on Earth. Millions of people lived under one emperor. But ruling such a huge empire wasn't easy. He needed honest, intelligent, and loyal officials. But there was one big problem. Rich families kept giving government jobs to their own relatives. Many talented people never got a chance, simply because they were poor. Can you imagine working your entire life and still being ignored? The emperor knew the system was unfair, so he asked a question that would change history forever. What if every person had to prove their knowledge before getting an important job? That simple idea became the world's first examination system. But the real exam was much harder than you could ever imagine. And what happened inside those rooms shocked historians for centuries. But this wasn't an ordinary test. It was one of the hardest exams ever created. Can you guess how long candidates stayed inside? 1 day? 2 days? No, many candidates stayed inside for 3 entire days and 2 nights. Yes, 72 hours. Imagine sitting in the same tiny room for 3 days. No family, no friends, no entertainment, only questions and silence. But here's the unbelievable part. They even brought their own food and water into the examination cell. Because once the doors were locked, nobody was allowed to leave. And if someone was caught cheating, the punishment was so severe, it terrified everyone. But what exactly happened to cheaters? So, what happened if someone tried to cheat? The answer wasn't simple. Before entering the examination hall, every candidate was carefully searched. Why? Because some people hid tiny cheat notes inside their clothes. Others even wrote tiny words on pieces of silk. But the guards knew every trick. If someone was caught cheating, their future could be destroyed. Many candidates were permanently banned from taking the exam again. In some dynasties, the punishment became even more severe. That's how important these exams were. But here's something even more incredible. Passing the exam could completely change your life. A poor farmer's son could become one of the most powerful officials in the empire. But only a tiny number of candidates ever reached that dream. So, how difficult was the exam itself? The next challenge was so difficult, many people spent years preparing for it. But what exactly was written on those exam papers? And why did they make even the smartest people fail? Let's find out. Now imagine, after studying for years, the exam finally begins. But what kind of questions were waiting inside? Believe it or not, there were no multiple-choice questions. No calculators, no internet, no books. Only your memory and your knowledge. Candidates had to memorize thousands of ancient texts. Some spent more than 10 years preparing for just one exam. Now, here's a question for you. Would you study for 10 years, just for one chance? Because if you failed, you had to start all over again. And some people repeated this process for decades. But then, one candidate did something no one expected. Who was this mysterious candidate? And how did he change the history of exams forever? If you passed the exam, your entire life could change overnight. A poor farmer's son could suddenly become one of the emperor's most respected officials. Money couldn't guarantee success. Only knowledge could. For the first time in history, intelligence became more valuable than family connections. But that doesn't mean the system was perfect. In fact, it had some serious problems. Many brilliant people failed simply because the exam was too difficult. Others spent their entire lives chasing just one dream. Now here's a question for you. Would you spend 10 years preparing for one single exam? Or would you choose a completely different path? But the biggest surprise is still waiting. Because the first exam in history still affects your life today. Now comes the biggest question. What was actually written on the world's first exam paper? Was it mathematics, science, or something completely different? The answer surprised historians. Most questions were based on the teachings of Confucius. Candidates had to memorize thousands of lines. One tiny mistake could cost everything. Imagine studying for years, only to fail because of a single mistake. Would you still take the exam? But this wasn't even the hardest part, because the final test decided who would become one of the most powerful people in the empire. But here's another mystery. Who came up with the idea of testing people through exams? The answer begins with one of history's greatest thinkers, Confucius. Confucius believed that knowledge and good character mattered more than family wealth. His ideas inspired Chinese rulers for centuries. Then, during the Sui dynasty, those ideas became an official examination system. For the first time, government jobs depended on knowledge instead of family connections. The system worked so well that other countries began paying attention. Centuries later, Europe became interested too. Governments realized that exams could help choose skilled officials more fairly, but schools still looked very different from today. So, when did school exams and class tests actually begin? The answer completely changed modern education. Ancient China's exams became famous, but schools still didn't have the exams we know today. For hundreds of years, students mainly learned by reading, memorizing, and answering questions out loud. Then came a major change: the British education system. During the 18th and 19th centuries, schools grew larger and governments needed a way to measure what students had learned, so written exams became more common. This is where many modern exam traditions began. Class tests were created to check learning regularly. Monthly tests helped schools track student progress. And final exams were designed to evaluate everything students had learned during the year. But here's the interesting part. This system didn't stay in Britain. As the British Empire expanded, its education system spread to many regions, including India. Later, after the partition, Pakistan inherited many of the same examination traditions. So the exam students take today have roots that stretch back thousands of years, from imperial palaces to modern classrooms, from government officials to students preparing for their next test. The purpose has changed, but the idea remains the same: to measure knowledge. So the next time you sit in an exam hall, remember this. You are taking part in a tradition that began more than 2,000 years ago in ancient China. And maybe the real question isn't who invented exams, but what will future generations think about the exams we take today? If you enjoyed discovering the history behind everyday things, subscribe for more surprising stories from the past.